Welcome to Cover Bookbeat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Our guest today is Frances Schoonmaker, retired educator of 25 years, who has transitioned to writing award-winning middle-grade fiction that entertains and inspires young readers. As a professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, she directed the graduate program in elementary and middle school education, program drawing heavily on story and children's literature. Schoonmaker headed the curriculum development team for the Lincoln Center Institute's Teaching Artists program and a doctoral seminar that explored children's literature and spirituality, funded by the Spencer Foundation. And this is not her first time. Earlier in the career, she had 5 books published in the Poetry for Young People series, writing about the poetry of Emily Dickinson, Carl Sandburg, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Edna St. Vincent Millay, and Robert Louis Stevenson. Her most recent work, and the subject of our interview today, is a YA trilogy which manages to involve time travel, magic, and a 3-generation saga that spans from 1856 to 1944. The books include The Black Alabaster Box, The Red Abalone Shell, and The Last Crystal. We're very pleased to welcome Frances Schoonmaker.
Oh, thank you. And hello to all your listeners in the beautiful Columbia River Gorge
Thank you.
area.
Now, you've taught, lectured, and consulted internationally, particularly in the Middle East and Asia. Do you find that broadened your scope of work?
Oh, absolutely. I think it broadens your outlook on life.
Mm-hmm. You're also a recipient of the Agatha Award for Best Middle Age Grade Young Adult Mystery. If we came to your house, would we find it in your mantle?
Well, you wouldn't. The Agatha Award is given by Malice Domestic. It's the largest fan organization for mystery stories and in the world, I guess. And they give a teapot, I suppose, in honor of Agatha Christie. But I got the award in 2019.
Uh-oh.
And yeah, so they said, well, it's okay. We'll give the teapots out in 2020 because COVID will all be to rest. So I'm still waiting for that teapot.
Oh my gosh. Wow, that's interesting. But the books, they're quick and entertaining. And I have to say, some of the best writing I run across today is on YA. And don't, as an adult, think that to be put off by that, because this 72-year-old enjoyed all 3 books as well as my 9-year-old granddaughter. But you also have an educational purpose that's woven into the stories, because you teach about some of the prejudice and exclusivity and exceptionalism, American exceptionalism in the 3 different books. And you talk about that in relationship to the Native American population, Black folks, prejudice against Germans in World War I and against Japanese in World War II. But it doesn't feel like it's stuck in there. It feels like it's organic to the plot. Is that hard to do?
I think when you're telling a story, if you're, it has to have a context, right? Mm-hmm. And as a writer, I could have made up the context, especially since I had the fantasy element. But I'm trained in historical methodology, and I love the history. So why not get it right? I like to think that I write books for kids that will keep them up reading after dark, and they'll be learning things they didn't know they wanted to know.
Yes. Well, what's intriguing to me is it starts in the first book in 1856 with a family moving west on the Santa Fe Trail. And I had flashbacks of playing that old Oregon Trail game back in the 70s with where you try to figure out, are you going to get smallpox, or are you going to have enough provisions, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of a neat flashback to it, but it also added a lot of detail that I found absolutely fascinating. How much research did you have to do to get all this done?
Oh, more than I imagined I would when I started out, because I kept running into things that I needed to know for me, even if I didn't write about them explicitly. It was sort of like having an informed backstory to draw on. But I can give you an example. I was very interested in how the greatest threat to pioneers going west was not Native Americans. I mean, we feel like it was because, especially those of us who were reared on John Wayne movies, where it circled the wagons and, but, and I knew that that was not the case. But what I didn't know was how crowded the trails were, and And the fact that actually, in my opinion, if we had a national graveyard, it really ought to be those trails. So many people died, most of them from disease. Right next to that was gun wound, injuries, where accidental shooting, people had accidents. They didn't have the methods for treating them. So I did find out. And then I found out details of things like scouting. In the first book, the protagonist has to make an escape, and I have to think about how did she know how to do that? So then I, had to do more research on what is it that scouts do. And I don't know, maybe your listeners would like to know, have an overview of where they're going, and then they'll have a context for these people we start to talk about.
Sure. Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, the trilogy are 3 books that could be read independently, but they're tied together by a common theme. So here's the deal. Back at the beginning of time, 7 crystals were set aside for the healing of the earth at times of great need. And they were placed in the charge of immortal twins who were to decide when they needed to be used, but one of them betrays the trust, steals the crystals to use for her own evil purposes. And so it's down to 1 crystal. And the other twin wants it back for its proper use. So in the first book in the trilogy, Grace Willis and her family are going west on the Santa Fe Trail. And she is a reluctant traveler, but she adjusts and experiences some of the adventure and privations of the trail. But she's kidnapped. And she has to decide whether she's going to pull up her socks and do something about that, or she's going to cave into despair. And it's when she takes action that she gets pulled into this quest for the crystal. In the second book, it's set right at the cusp of the US going to war with, in World War I with Germany. And James, who's the protagonist, finds himself sitting on the steps of a little church in western Oklahoma, not far from the Santa Fe Trail. The trail grounds all 3 books as well. He doesn't know who he is, how he got there. And the only clues he has are an old map, a red abalone shell, that's the name of the book, the red abalone shell, and a dog. He is adopted by a German pacifist family, and he has to decide his own stance on pacifism. At the same time, he's trying to discover who he is, and he gets drawn into the quest. And in the third book, which has the title, The Last Crystal, 4 kids are put on the train in Kansas City to go to stay with their boring old uncle in California, and who turns out not to be so boring, but that's, I don't want to give away too much. And before they even get halfway on their journey, they've encountered a Nazi spy. One of them has been kidnapped. And in an attempt to rescue her, all 4 end up in this vast prehistoric wilderness area. And the only way they can get home is to find the last crystal. But all they have to help them are their wits, each other, and an old map, which happens to be the same old map that James in book 2 finds. But the only one of them that can read the old map is the youngest. So that in a nutshell is the last crystal.
There you go. I will have to say that there were some preparations that were made. One of the, in the last, by the way, I understand you wrote the last book first. Is that correct?
I did. Well, see, I had this story in my head, and as you know, I taught school for years, and story was really important, to me in my classrooms. And we made a trip from Baltimore to Sacramento, California one summer. And we actually ended up speaking to each other at the end of that trip. But it was a long trip, and we followed, more or less followed that route. Now, I had done that several times because my parents taught school in the Pacific Northwest, and we still had the farm in Oklahoma. So I knew that route really well. What I didn't know was this uncle-in-law and his little brother were packed up every summer in Kansas City, put on the train, and sent to Sacramento unaccompanied.
Oh,
I
yeah.
kept thinking, gosh, I taught school for a number of years and just about every age group. And I thought, what would two little guys get up to on a train? And then that kept nagging at me until it grew into the story. But I couldn't find a motive. I knew I wanted a quest.
Mhm.
And partly because I had been very impressed by Carl Sandburg's Rutabaga stories and his note that American kids were growing up without their own quest stories, that we depended on castles and kings and other universes for our stories. And so I thought, that this has the makings of a quest. But you've got to have a motive that's powerful enough to drive something like that. So I played with the story, and I had notes, all of which were lost by the time I got around to writing it. But one of the things I did in my professional life at Teachers College was work on a USAID project that the college did in collaboration with the Pakistani Higher Education Commission to kind of upgrade schools and teacher performance in Pakistan. So in the years that I did that, going back and forth like 3 or 4 weeks at a time, I made really good friends with a young man whose family had a jewelry store in Islamabad. And it was one of the few shopping centers that I really could go to, for security reasons. And I loved visiting with him and learning about the jewels. But one time I went in, there wasn't anybody in the store, and I think I had to have something repaired. I, wouldn't be investing in lots of jewelry, but he said, I want to show you something. He was so excited. So he pulls this rock out of the showcase, but then I look at it, it's about as big as the palm of his hand, and it is highly polished, and you can look into it, and in the center is a bubble of water. So it's kind of crystallized. And it was like, wow. He said, I'm never going to sell this. So we were speculating about, gosh, how old is that water? So we decided it was from the dawn of time. Well, I get away from there and I go, like, I hadn't been thinking about this book for, ages. And I go, Fountain of Youth. Well, I had thought of the Fountain of Youth before, but it's a well trod trail. And it's one we're still walking. I mean, we may read about it, but we're also buying wrinkle cream.
Exactly.
So I had my motive. So I wrote the third book, and I was very happy with it, except I had these questions that kept bothering me, before I would let it go. And it was like, how come this? How come that? So I ended up, trying to develop the backstory, and because I had located the train as the Santa Fe Chief, because it's such an interesting train, then I located the story on the Santa Fe Trail, and that was sort of how it evolved backward.
Interesting, very, very interesting. But I will have to say, without giving too much more away, that if given my name, I was delighted that one of the very coolest people in the book is Mr. Nichols. So thank you for that. And I won't give away his part in the proceedings, but it's a major part in the proceedings. And I felt a glow every time I saw the name. So thank you for that. Indeed.
Oh, good.
Boy, there's so many interesting things. I started to check my notes over here. Let's see. I took a few notes here. The question is, can I read my writing at this point? I
hear you.
One of the quotes I took down, it says, religious freedom doesn't mean anything to some people. For them, freedom means freedom for everybody to believe the same thing and act in the same way. And that's far too true these days, and always has been, I suspect.
Yeah, that really hits a nerve now, doesn't it? I personally feel so strongly, for example, about being vaccinated. And I do appreciate when people say, well, interferes with my freedom. But I also want to ask him, would you stop at traffic lights? I mean, that's a major interference with my freedom to move about a city.
Mhm.
But I do that because it's for the greater good, and it also keeps me from getting crashed into. I mean, hopefully.
Yeah.
So in the books, yeah, that notion of freedom of the individual always has to be thought about in context, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Um, in the first book, the context has to do with that notion of manifest destiny, you know, and
Mhm.
the idea that we actually had the moral obligation to conquer the West, whereas the people who live there, you know, certainly weren't seeing it that way. They didn't feel uncivilized or in the need of being conquered, and the clash that occurs, even though it doesn't surface as that, the history underlying the trails and the motive for going west is definitely there. It becomes more explicit in the books when you get to book two, or yes, in book two, because you have the right of people who believe it's wrong to engage in war versus the right of the country to ask people to take a stand, if you will, you know,
Mhm.
through for democracy, um, you know, through engaging in war. So how do you reconcile those? And is there a way to do that without setting up structures that end up being very damaging? The one of the things I learned, just one of the reasons I love history, you know, the more you dig, the more interesting
Mhm.
things you discover. But one of the things I learned was that during the uh, precursors, you know, the years leading up to our involvement in World War One, there was a tremendous amount of pressure on German and Italian Americans, and a great deal of persecution. And many of them were rounded up and put in internment camps. And they were people who were second generation. And you know, I suppose there may have been people who were trying to undermine the war effort, but most of them were good people. You know, many of them farmers, you know,
Mhm.
working the land, trying to create their version of the American dream. And what we did when we set up those internment camps in World War One was develop the prototype for what we did in World War Two with the
Mhm.
Japanese immigrants.
Mhm.
And I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
And in book two, the children encounter a Japanese sergeant who's a member of that very famous Japanese military unit, who were so heroic in their activity during World War II, many of whom were from Hawaii and whose fathers were rounded up, sent to the mainland, and imprisoned in a prison near Santa Fe.
Mhm.
And it just, you know, it's just so incredulous that we did that.
Yeah. I was lucky enough to grow up in with a classmate whose father was in the 442nd
Oh,
unit,
wow.
and they were sent to, mostly fought in North Africa and in Italy, and
Uh-huh.
were the most highly decorated unit in all of the war. So
In all of World War II.
yeah,
Yeah, they were
so
incredible. Now, this sergeant wouldn't have been riding the train ordinarily, but because they rode troop trains, but he's on leave and he's on off to see, they learn later that he's off to try to see his father, who's being held a prisoner while he's being decorated for defending the
yeah,
US.
yeah. There's another touch in that in book two that I liked, and it's very subtle. But at one point, the kids are in class and they say the Pledge of Allegiance. They say the original Pledge of
Yes.
Allegiance before they added the words under God. And I
Uh-huh.
thought somebody has done her research on the time periods for that one.
Well, you were kind not to say you must have been in school then.
That never occurred to
But
me, but no,
truth
no.
be told, I was.
Yeah. But that was a change that it definitely did take place. And most people there are unaware of that because I grew up in the 50s and it was done by the time I got into grade school.
Yeah.
Yeah. So wow, it's just amazing. Um, and what I also find out is the kids have never heard of the Lost Crystal or any of this backstory. They're drawn into it as we are at the same time. And then we watch them deal with the knowledge and the situations that get set up on that. So you've got viewpoint characters that are bringing us along.
Yeah. I love to tell the story of how I originally handled the fantasy, the history versus the fantasy.
Mhm.
It's something you have to think about. And because I'm a, retired academic who, I've spent my life doing things I hope are for the betterment of kids, whether in the classroom of an elementary school or in a university classroom. But, I was inclined to pilot the books before I let them out. And I piloted the Black Alabaster Box in some classrooms that were varied, urban, suburban, private. And as the teachers and the children, work their way through, I had it set up so that you're going along to a certain point. Everything is on like a historical fiction. And then suddenly it all shifts when Grace meets Mr. Nichols.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it, in a story when I'm reading and I think I'm going in one direction and then suddenly the carpet is out from under me and I'm sort of standing there like Coyote at the edge of a cliff, or a roadrunner. They did not love it. And that was true across the classrooms. They did not love it. Some of them even were so frustrated by that they didn't want to finish reading the book, and their teachers would say, no, we think you'll like it. Then this is, we have an opportunity here. Let's read. Well, then they got caught up in the story again and loved it. But when they wrote me their thank you letters, which I recognized were probably forced, forced thank yous by teachers, they were very frank about it. And some of them said, please, next story, could you write one that goes all the way to California without the fantasy? Well, I was so excited when I heard that because not because I was going to need to do some rewriting, but because to think kids could get that interested in history.
Yeah.
And, loving it as story. And then they said, they went on to say what they liked about the book. Well, of course, I had an assignment then. I'd written the book this way. And I thought, I should have known better. I've been working with kids for X years. I should have known better than that. I walked right into that. So I was struggling with what I was going to do, how I would reframe it. And a friend who's been a critical reader for me along the way said, well, what about the dog? Couldn't he be a time traveler? So old Shep, who's named after my grandmother's dog, is the one who immediately introduces the fact that there's magic afoot in each of the books.
And old Shep is much more than a dog. And I think it might my dog Spot. Wish it could have been as good as old Shep was. So, yeah. And there's also a horse of particular skill and power. It made me think of Shadowfax from the I've lost the author's name from Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's.
Yes, Tolkien's. Yeah. Well, yes, Song of the Wind is Mr. Nichols' horse, and quite a remarkable horse.
Yes, and all of this, but without giving too much away, once in book 3, when they leave the train and they're suddenly back in time, there's a real Trek story there. There's a long journey, and some of the things that they have learned, and one of the kids is like Mr. Boy Scout in terms of being prepared, has a big knapsack with all kinds of things in it, and they have to use every single thought and they don't always get along either. They get this just like real kids. They don't always agree, and then they discover they really need to in order to survive. So there are multiple lessons in here, but they're not preached at you lessons. They're lessons that evolve organically from the story. And so my compliments for that.
Oh, thank you. That of course is the hope. That the whole survival thing has always been interesting to me. My father was a teacher as well as a farmer. My mother also was a teacher, but I remember something my father said once when there was this wave of criticism, as there often is. It's sort of like a Ferris wheel, things come back around. That kids today knew so much more than they did in his day. And, therefore we needed to be teaching them more, or whatever the, conclusion is. But he said, I don't think the kids I'm teaching know any more than I did when I was a boy. They know different.
Yes.
And he said, if you had taken me out into the woods and turned me loose and left me, I could have survived, because I knew things you need to know to read the woods. But he said, if I took any of the kids in my classroom out and turned them loose in the woods, they'd be dead.
Yeah.
And I thought about that as I constructed this story, realizing what kids might have known. Although I suppose it is a bit of a cheat to have the one so well equipped. But he is authentic. I've known so many little guys like him, and girls too. As easily have been a girl with a backpack full of stuff just in case you need it.
And the nice thing about it is that as they explore this and go use all of these things, then the people who are reading learn how to use those things and what they're for, and why they should probably have some if they're going to be out in the wilderness. So it's a very practical help.
Yeah, one of the things that kids tell me as they start the trilogy is how much they enjoy the chapter in the Black Alabaster Box where Grace is learning how to be a scout, because Mr. Payne, who happens to be African American, but who has been an Army scout, is teaching her to keep her occupied because her mother has come down with the pox. And that was essential for her later to use in her own escape. But, the kids have really enjoyed reading that. And I had to do my research. I might have survived in the woods, not as easily as my father would have, partly because he taught us some of those skills, but there's a lot more to it. And it was very, very interesting to me, to do that research. But those lessons of kindness and interdependence, as well as the history itself, I think are very, very important. And the other thing I make a careful point of doing is, with the exception of the ending in book 1, the kids are never rescued by superheroes. They're ordinary kids placed in unusual circumstances who figure out that they have to do and do.
It's a wonderful, wonderful situation. You've been very generous with your time, but I want to ask if there's anything that we've not covered that you think our listeners really need to know.
Oh my. Well, I think it's a good book for any age, really. And my oldest fan actually is 98. But I think there's so many stories within the stories. But I suppose what I'd really want people to take away from this is that it's a story based on real history as we know it today, and that history may change. And it changes not out of whim, but as we learn more, as we have better archaeological work. Some of our conception of what it was really like going west, it has changed, and that feels very uncomfortable for some people, because it's kind of like, well, this is how I've understood it. On the other hand, it's incredibly liberating to know that we're not the only ones who make mistakes. That people made those mistakes and they weren't bad people for the most part. I mean, occasionally you get somebody you'd say, "Ooh, that," but most of us are really good people trying to do the right thing, and they were. And so we don't have to disparage them to say, you know what, there was another way to look at this. And a lot of the pioneers who wrote letters back gave a very glowing picture of what the trip was like. And I suppose there were some who sort of slipped under the radar and didn't have any problems. But, think about if you decided you wanted to immigrate to Australia and your family says that is a stupid idea. And you say, well, not only that, I'm going to take a freighter. And they say, this is really dumb. And then, your freighter is captured by pirates, and you have run into an oil spill and all these things. When you get to port, you might say, wow, we were captured by pirates. You're not going to tell them about the time you stupidly, overate or overindulged and you got really, really sick, or whenever you failed to heed the captain's advice and fell overboard and had to be rescued and it took all afternoon. You're going to tell the good story, because if you tell the real story, they're going to say, we told you so.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Absolutely.
so we have to have multiple sources of information. And we do learn from some of the letter accounts a great deal, but there's so much more to learn. And some of that can only be learned through kind of the scientific digging and looking and analyzing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm especially sensitive to that in relationship to the Chumash people, who were some of the first inhabitants of the US mainland, who came to California. Have a fascinating history. And I did a great deal of research about them for book 1. And they weren't even in book 3 when I finished book 3. But I did this research, and I had a small body of information that I could call on. And I even visited a Chumash village that's been set up in the way it might have looked on the coast. But since I wrote that and it's been published, that body of information is about 3 times larger because of the fascinating work being done. So it may mean that what I said in book 1 turns out really to not be an accurate picture. But I don't withdraw it. I say, that's what I understood when I wrote the book. And that could become the foundation for fascinating discussions with kids about, oh, this is what we knew then, and look what we know now.
I want to make
hopefully in a context of respect and kindness.
And I want one more point that I did want to make, and I forgot to mention that earlier. That is your characters. We've got some bad people in it, but not all of them stay bad all the way through. And so that kind of brings the fact that some of them, obviously not all, but some of them are capable of redemption. And it maybe helps us in looking at people to think that as well.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right.
Plus, the people you're talking about, I suppose the baddies you love to hate, are introduced as really obnoxious children in book 1. And then we meet them as outlaws before the book is over.
Yes.
And it's sort of like you say, we knew you were going to turn out bad.
Yeah.
But then I don't know if there's anyone who's all bad.
Interesting.
I'd like to think there's that spark. Maybe it doesn't get ignited, but there's that human spark of goodness in everyone. It just may get turned down where nobody can see it.
That's right. Well, thank you so much. Our guest today has been Frances Schoonmaker. The book is the Last Crystal Trilogy. Highly recommended. Oh, want to mention a website or any other things? Yes,
I do. I recognize that Frances Schoonmaker is not a household name, and it's not one that you necessarily will find easy to remember, but you can enter the Last Crystal Trilogy on a search engine, and you can find me. And so if you enter fschoonmaker.com, you can find my website. And I would love to hear from your listeners via my website. I've just had it, given a facelift, and I'm still ironing out some kinks, but I can get correspondence from people. And if you want to buy it, I'm a big champion of independent local bookstores. So you can ask for it and they'll get it for you, or the usual Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Book Depository, online sources. It's available.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for being with us today and being generous with your time. The books are excellent, no matter what your age. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it.